but this main question, David, is what study or research would you like to share about, and what do you think is interesting about this study or research?
So, does it have to be specific to a particular study?
No. We've been talking a little bit about the importance of understanding that research comes kind of in a line of research, or that there's people have multiple interests, but that research happens kind of on a trajectory where people are doing more exploratory and different reviews, and there's different developmental studies using single subject designs or qualitative work, and we've talked to a couple people doing clinical trials. So great, yeah, we're open.
Good. Well, I can tell a pretty good story about the work I've done most recently in mathematics, because I was a high school math and science teacher, and I taught in a number of different school districts in the U.S., but also in the Peace Corps, and was always fascinated by how complex mathematics was, and how I think as a teacher, understanding cognition was so interesting when you're looking at things like mathematics, because it is so abstract, particularly at the high school level. So when I moved back to Oregon in 2000, I was very interested in making a bit of a shift in my focus on kind of instructional design, which was what I had sort of done, but mostly in the area of reading, because early literacy was such a big topic back in the 1990s, that I wrote a paper with Russell Gersten about early number sense, and it got us thinking quite a bit about sort of the notion of what sort of inherent ideas we have about quantity as human beings. And there had been some writing kind of in that area by some cognitive scientists, and then work done at Harvard, but also at the University of London, looking at primate behavior, and not just human beings, but in fact early young primates also have this sort of inherent sense of quantity. So we were very interested in that topic, and then when in the course of my work at the U of O, Scott Baker and I wrote a grant proposal on early learning in mathematics, and our real interest was in how do you take, if it is indeed the case that young children have these senses about quantity that are probably predate verbal sort of kind of development, that there should be a knowledge base about this, and indeed there is, and you all may want to look into the work by Doug Clements and others that have looked at early childhood mathematics development.
Okay, great.
And so we decided to look at what was happening in kindergarten classrooms, and Russell Gersten had an earlier grant where we did some qualitative observations in the Springfield schools in Oregon, looking at how kindergarten mathematics was taught. And at the time, it was pretty unsophisticated. Early counting, or patterns, colors, etc. So we decided to really look at, and simultaneously, this was sort of the beginning of the standards movement. So we began to, if you have young students in your class, many of them will have a hard time believing that we were doing work before the standards movement. But right. Indeed, late 1980s, there were no standards in the United States of any sort in education. So this was sort of a big deal. So we decided that in kindergarten, you really should focus your attention around the development of number sense, language related to number sense, and then and vocabulary development, of course, and a couple of other areas, so basic geometry, and I think those were the key pieces. So we created we had a series of studies funded by the Institute for Education Science, and They were to work with teachers, and we partnered with teachers in Springfield schools, doing a design study where we would create lessons, they would try them, we would modify them, and then we shaped a curriculum for kindergarten around this called Early Learning in Mathematics. And then we got a subsequent efficacy grant to test it in schools, and we did subsequent studies in schools in Eugene and also schools here in Dallas. I'm not sure if we had any Portland schools that were involved. I can't remember now. But and the interesting thing we found was that strong students entering the classroom with pretty strong quantitative skills, like they could do some early count, they could do kind of a range of counting, rote counting and object counting, and they had a sense of cardinality, you know, what it means when a number 3, what 3 means. They could subbatize, you know, they could look at small numbers of objects and without counting them know immediately how many there were there.
Sure, sure.
And those students did no better in our program than they did in whatever the teachers in the business as usual classes were doing.
Got it. Got it. Yes.
But students who were entering with low language, many on IEPs for SLI, specific language impairments, or students who had not had formal preschool opportunities, those students performed better when they received the instruction that we were providing in this more, and you know, be quite honest with you, kind of structured curriculum around those 4 basic areas that we were focusing on.
Sounds a lot like RTI.
Yeah, interesting, huh? And this all predated RTI, of course, because we were doing these studies certainly before. Well, it didn't predate the multi-tier model that a lot of RTI has been interpreted to mean, but RTI had not become part of special ed law yet at that point. So the other kind of interesting thing about this is that I left Oregon in 2007, but the team at the Center for Teaching and Learning at the U of O then expanded it. We created a booster piece for students who we felt needed additional vocabulary development. They created a first grade program. So they've really sort of kind of enriched the mathematics pieces there. And then I have sort of taken a lot of this work overseas as well. So I was invited to be part of a, I don't know if you are familiar with the Education for All initiative that the World Bank and the United Nations is spearheading, but the idea is to build...
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, the idea is to build greater literacy skills and numeracy skills in the roughly lowest billion population in the world. So largely sub-Saharan Africa, Central and parts of South America and Southeast Asia. So we created some small measures for collecting data, and we were working country by country, trying to create sort of an understanding of why mathematics is much more sophisticated than just learning to count and to calculate. And we've been, reasonably successful. We've done some work in Liberia and Zambia and East Africa, Malawi, and yeah. So, and I'm going to Tonga in a few months to begin working there on some. Actually, that's focused on literacy, but I suspect they'll eventually get to numeracy.
Where is Tonga?
Tonga is in the South Pacific. It's very small island country, 67 islands, and more Tongans live in the United States than live in Tonga. So
that's very interesting work. We have a new faculty, Holly Lawson, who's a U of O graduate, who's just coming on. We've hired her, and she's starting this summer. She's worked for the Open Society in London, leading their early childhood initiatives around the world, their grant program. And so it would be interesting speaking with her about that initiative you mentioned. We're starting to think about how some of our work can translate, outside of the U.S. My focus on communication, I think, would be, I'm definitely going to look into that initiative. So for the students, hearing about this project that you've described, this is very fascinating because we had our first guest speaker for the class. It's a fully online program. This guest speaker, we had a live event. She comes in, she says, listen, I don't want to make this all about me, but I've had a hearing impairment my whole life, and I went to preschool special education. And the question she posed was, is it inevitable that children go into kindergarten who have disabilities, do they go in behind? And hearing about your research that you were able to close that gap, or that the trajectory wasn't in line, that you were able to fix that trajectory for this group of students, that's very encouraging to hear. We've talked a bit in our class about that research comes from our practices, and we heard from a researcher at Vanderbilt, Ann Kaiser, was talking about her early language work, and she said she's a blue-collar researcher, that she's an interventionist, and she was down at the school, and that's why she was running a couple minutes late. And so it's neat hearing about your mathematics work and how you delved into it, being inspired and found kind of these foundational principles, and then really went to town. And it's sometimes when we hear about these grant cycles and IES, it sounds like, oh, we did that in 6 months or something. And we're trying to explain to the students that this research takes a lot of time and energy and effort, along with resources, funding levels from, we've talked to NIH researchers and IES researchers as well. So it's really cool hearing that backstory of that grant and how the curriculum was built out of that work. I think that's going to be really interesting for the students to hear.
Yeah, it's interesting that Anne used the term blue-collar researcher, because I often call our school here at SMU a blue-collar research institution, because all of our faculty are most interested in less the theoretical components but much more of a what works kind of view of their own research. And you can't hire everybody, so you have to sort of focus. And so we hire people who have that idea in mind, that they want to improve outcomes for students, whether they have learning disabilities or some kind of cognitive delay. You've made the comment that, is it inevitable that we start with gaps? And I think that's an artifact of our system. Right? It's taken a long time to figure this out, but you get to a certain age where things begin to get a little bit clearer. But gaps are an artifact of our system. I mean, you probably have special talents that I don't have. But as adults, we don't pay attention to those, right? They're much less. We call them interests, or, I don't play the guitar. I'd love to play the guitar, don't. So the gap between guitar players and myself is huge.
Yes, yes.
But somehow in schools, these gaps become much more important to us for some reason. And I'm not suggesting we shouldn't work hard to move children along and to expect benchmark performance. That's certainly not the way I think. But I also think we have to be reasonable, that if a student comes from a background where I recently lost the hearing in my left ear, and I now know how critical it is to be able to hear with great clarity. And when children don't hear well, or they have a history of ear infection, or it could be all kinds of reasons. It could be other sensory impairments. But this is going to put them at a disadvantage in a typical classroom, and that's the system at work. It's not the child is not the problem. It's the system that's the problem.
Yeah, we're studying real hard about this universal design for learning construct, and it's making a lot of sense that you need to kind of have the curriculum and the content environment perceptually accessible, kind of at a front level. This multiple means of representation or accessible instructional materials. It makes a lot of sense.
It does. It does. And, at the same time, I think that partly what augurs against this is that we now have an accountability system in place that emphasizes the system. We've got standards that are grade leveled. We've got assessments that are grade leveled. Our expectations kind of work in that grade level. And, there are upsides to that. When we didn't have standards and we didn't have accountability systems, we will often let schools in poor communities, for example, flounder without any kind of realization of how bad they were for the children who were in those schools. Yeah. But at the same time, it doesn't. In the late 1990s, we fought to get children with disabilities included in the accountability system because we knew if they weren't included, they would be relegated to whatever schools wanted to do to them. And at the same time, they will always cause a gap, right? The accountability system will always recognize the gaps and emphasize the gaps. And I think with Common Core being adopted, it's just, we've got some challenges ahead of us.
Oh, yes, this is very interesting thread of conversation for me personally, but the students are asking in our conversations and just seeing how they're interacting with the course. One of the tasks is that they're asking, how do I select what to focus on? That I'm hearing about all these things that are calling themselves evidence-based practices. We're looking at need across all these areas of the class is a cohort of students in early intervention, early childhood. But we're talking about so many different needs, and then bring up mathematical skill. And I think where this goes is that there are decisions to be made. You can't focus on everything all at one time. And so really being thoughtful and knowing about child development, human development, and thinking about where are we going to place our efforts. So if I think that's where the importance of instruction, assessment comes in and understanding where students are at. But we've looked at some research about treatment intensity and saying, is more actually better? Because if we spend too much time on it, then we don't have time to focus on mathematics. Let's say if we're focusing on communication in particular. If we can get away with 3 sessions versus 6, and it's going to have the same impact, it's going to free up space to intervene or teach in other areas. So very interesting thinking about that. There's going to be variance in children. They're not all going to develop along this even trajectory, or even just with the growth models, that there's going to be variance. And so taking that into account and trying to prioritize, I think, is a real interesting area to think about for these clinicians and for researchers alike. How do we give advice on what to prioritize in? Seems pretty complex, but sometimes
it is. Although I would encourage you and your students to think about, one of the beauties of early childhood is looking for ways to intersect content with language. And clearly the most important thing for them to focus on. It's not hard for me to prioritize early childhood. It's about language development.
Absolutely.
And so mathematics, particularly at the early childhood level, is all about language development. Bigger and smaller and more and less. And this is what gives kids the tools to be mathematical thinkers down the road. So, learning to count, putting things in order, sequencing. I have to believe everything I'm saying falls into the communication realm.
Absolutely. But being conscious about tying those things in, that's where we can make those decisions and set those goals, or they might be objectives. But we're teaching all of our students to kind of look at this kind of infused skills grid tool as a simple hack to that putting that into practice. But it's the same, same type of skill when we're trying to look at evidence-based practices, looking at where does this puzzle fit together, where's the intersect. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a really good thing for the students to hear.
There is a group. They used to be at the SUNY Buffalo. Now most of them have migrated to the University of Denver. Doug Clements and Julie Sarama, and in fact, I can send you, Sam, a little paper that they wrote for the National Governors Association. They invited a group of us to come and present to the National Governors Association about early childhood mathematics. And I think within that, their examples will give your students some ideas of ways to sort of intersect the communication skills they're trying to build with things that would be beneficial as children grow, as they think more and more mathematically. So I'll dig that up. It might be in rough draft form, but I'll send it your way and share that with them.
That would be great. That would be terrific. So I have two other short questions.
Yeah.
This one is about thinking about what research is important for clinicians. So what do you think is most important for clinicians to understand about research? Teachers, workers in early intervention?
Yeah, well, one of the most important things for people to understand, I think, is that creating trustworthy evidence takes time. And research doesn't tell you what to do on Monday at 10 a.m. So it's, I think clinicians, teachers, early interventionists have to simultaneously keep focus on evidence-based practice, almost like a daily diet of, thinking about, reflecting on the practices they use, and then recognizing where the evidence is that supports or confirms that, but also recognizing that in many cases we have to make good professional judgments, keep our own data, review those data, say, okay, in the absence of any other evidence, I've got to implement what I think is working here based on the data I've collected, and then I think related to that is context is critical. So I might do a study that's published in the Journal of Special Education. Reading that context and understanding that context is so important, and we're getting better at identifying what those mediators are. But I think oftentimes we are guilty as faculty of saying the research says, when in fact we know that context can make an enormous difference. So anyway, those are a couple of, I think, really important pieces that.
That's really helpful. I think that'll be well received and thought provoking. This last conversation I just had with Ann Kaiser, she talked about how they were doing an efficacy study, IES efficacy study, where they were taking their practice, which they had refined over a number of years, trying it with a new population, and then they were also workshopping how to do their practice of this enhanced milieu teaching with a whole group and get it done at a classroom level. And they were talking about how challenging that was. And so that kind of highlights what you're saying, that we like to say, oh, this is an evidence-based practice, and that there's this context involved of, well, what conditions? Do they have a one-on-one instructional environment? That's where it's been well refined, that practice. But in the classroom, we don't know necessarily what influences its success fully. So that's really good advice for the students, and I appreciate hearing that as well.
And I think it's not unique to teaching. I think it's true in almost every professional field. We get, and I think the more technical the field becomes, sometimes the less tolerant we are of context. We think it should just work. So, if you're a speech-language pathologist and you have very specific technical knowledge about language development, and somehow it's not working the way you want it to. Sometimes we have to pay attention to context. I mean, the Ebola crisis in West Africa, for example. We know there are certain best evidence practices in treating Ebola, but you drop that into a small village where the culture will treat it as, witchcraft or, whatever it happens to be. You've got to understand that. You can't just assume that there's a remedy that you're just going to.
Have you happened to have read this book by Rogers, Diffusion of Innovations?
I've seen it. I've not read it.
Oh, okay. It's fascinating around this topic of creating change in a culture, and the science of it is really just unbelievably fascinating.
Interesting. I'll pick it up.
Yeah, it's a great summer read. Last quick question.
Yeah.
Where do you think educational research should be headed?
Oh, goodness. There are so many answers to that, and I'll try to keep it brief. But I think there's a great article in the Harvard Business Review recently by Clay Christensen that I don't necessarily recommend people read, but I reference it because he talks about our struggling economy. I mean, we have the most powerful economy in the world, and we're just sort of limping along right now post this recession. And his argument is that the market, what we've done is we've invested in efficiency and we've invested in process, both of which reduce jobs. Because if you're doing things more smoothly and more efficiently, you can reduce the number of people involved in the work, which means you get a better bottom line for a company, but not necessarily better quality for people. And he says the one area we have not invested in is market creation. Like, what are the things that we've not paid attention to? What are the areas where we really should be thinking about the fringe of the market? And I think to me, it's a perfect analog for education. So cycle back to our earlier conversation about the system. The system has we've created this accountability system to make sure it's working better. And we've become so myopic on trying to understand the system, we've forgotten that we've got to innovate. We've really got to think about the fringe elements of our work. What things haven't we considered? They run from, I think, sort of the very mundane to kind of sublime things that we've not even thought about. And should 30 kids be in a classroom? Should we be going after? Actually, the Gates Foundation has invested recently, are pledging to invest in some innovative school models. But their history has been create these innovative school models, but they still look like schools. There's still 400, 500, 1,100 kids in a system with one teacher and 30 children. And I think we've just not been terribly creative. We've just kept going after the same system, trying to make it more efficient and more smoothly operating, rather than really trying to shake it up and studying other ways of doing things.
That's very exciting, that line of thinking. That's very interesting.
I don't know who's going to fund it, but...
Well, I that's what I started thinking of, is that when you have this value on evidence-based practice and funding goes to things that are going to get through that peer review of saying, oh, this is a feasible study, this is an important area, this is going to work, then there's going to be a bias away from things that are more risky, potentially.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to hear.
But you need to balance the portfolio, right? To use the market analogy, you've got to come up with I mean, there are some things, Lynn and Doug Fuchs and Deb Simmons did some things in the 90s called peer-assisted learning strategies.
Yes.
Where they said, what if we compared if kids were given the tools to teach each other, and then we compared them to the effectiveness of the teacher, and almost without exception, the PALS program outperformed any kind of teacher program. And it was a very simple idea, and it actually was still within the system of what works.
Sure.
But it was pretty innovative thinking, and people, initially were skeptical, but you can actually teach a third grader to teach some reading skills that teachers were struggling to accomplish in the finite amount of time they had.
That's really inspiring and interesting that you bring Clayton Christensen, into that conversation. The innovator's dilemma, this idea of disruption, and that's good to hear that you think educational research should have that element in it, where people are trying out new things, innovating. In our area, we're developing this new lab called the Universal Design Lab, or the U Lab, at Portland State University.
Mm-hmm.
One of our main goals is to study how to fuse good instruction and technology. So not to kind of just run with some of these new things, but really bring it together with good practices. Sometimes, though, that means trying out kind of wild stuff, like we're checking out Google Glass and these new smart watches, and so it's exciting and fun. But encouraging hearing what you're saying about different school models. Lots of work to do in education around innovation.
For sure.
So thanks, David, for taking so much time. We've meant for each of these conversations to be very concise, but it gets so fun talking about people's research. So thanks.
Sure, and I hope it's helpful, and good luck with the class, and it's great to meet you, Sam.
Likewise. See you around.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.